better. Me?
Hello, everyone. This is the 5th Epical Revelation Fellowship Study Group. I'm Reverend Dr. Roger Paul. I'm here with my wife, Reverend Diane Paul, and Millie Williams this morning. We may have a couple more people join us on Skype. This morning we're going to study paper 125, Jesus at Jerusalem. And it's Mother's Day, so before we do that, I'm going to read a little quote from Jesus here before we get started. So say a short prayer, and then we'll get started. Father, we thank you for bringing us together again this morning, and we want to give a special pause to think about all those individuals out there that are mothers and give them special attention today. We thank you for our mothers and all they do for us and all the wonderful things they do through the universe. And we know they're fashioned after the infinite spirit, the universal mother spirits and the infinite spirit. And we thank you for that mothering instinct in each one of them, that they might bring each one of us to the point of fruition so that we can become immortal and come to see you one day. So we thank you and we ask you to bless each and every one of them across the world. And we give you the praise in your Son Michael's name, Jesus of Nazareth. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, and this is Jesus talking on this quote, and it's up here on the wall behind me. Which reminds me, Millie, can you see the video this morning?
I can see you. I can see the wall, but I can't read any of it.
Oh,
It's
okay.
too small.
Too small, okay. Well,
Yeah.
we'll read it to you.
I've got another block beside you that's got Val's name under it, but he's not there.
Yeah, he didn't pick
You're
up.
only part of my screen.
Oh, okay. Well, Val will pop out here in a minute, probably.
Now you're my full screen, and it's blurry. I can't. It's not in focus. I can't see it.
Okay.
It's not. It's not my glasses. It's your screen.
Yeah, I know.
You're blurry.
I
You're
can see you
blurry too.
perfectly.
Yeah. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to read this quote. Excuse me. I'm going to try to read this quote. And then, in bidding him farewell, Jesus said, oh, this is Jesus talking when he was on his way back from Rome, by the way. This is paper 133.
On his way back from what?
Rome. This is
Okay.
when Jesus was on his way back from Rome. And then, in bidding him farewell, Jesus said, my brother, always remember that man has no rightful authority over woman unless the woman has willingly and voluntarily given him such authority. Your wife has engaged to go through life with you to help you fight its battles and to assume the far greater share of the burden of bearing and rearing your children. And in return for this special service, it is only fair that she receive from you that special protection which man can give to woman as the partner who must carry, bear, and nurture the children. The loving care and consideration which a man is willing to bestow upon his wife and their children are the measure of that man's attainment of the higher levels of creative and spiritual self-consciousness. Do you not know that men and women are partners with God in that they cooperate to create beings who grow up to possess themselves of the potential of immortal souls? The Father in heaven treats the Spirit Mother of the children of the universe as one equal to himself. It is godlike to share your life and all that relates thereto on equal terms with the mother partner who so fully shares with you that divine experience of reproducing yourself in the lives of your children. If you can only love your children as God loves you, you will love and cherish your wife as the Father in heaven honors and exalts the infinite Spirit, the mother of all spirit children of the vast universe. And that's honoring mothers today. I want to read that.
Thank you.
That was
That was one of the things that came. I get little messages every day, and that last sentence was part of it.
Yeah, from Truth Book or Foundation one. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, today's paper 125, Jesus at Jerusalem. Would you like to start for us, Millie?
Okay. No incident in all Jesus' eventful earth career was more engaging, more humanly thrilling than this, his first remembered visit to Jerusalem. He was especially stimulated by the experience of attending the temple discussions by himself, and it long stood out in his memory as the great event of his later childhood and early youth. This was his first opportunity to enjoy a few days of independent living, the exhilaration of going and coming without restraint and restriction. This brief period of undirected living during the week following the Passover was the first complete freedom from responsibility he had ever enjoyed, and it was many years subsequent to this before he again had a like period of freedom from all sense of responsibility, even for a short time.
Okay, so when they came into Jerusalem, this is the first opportunity Jesus had to just be on his own and enjoy himself, didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty. Oh, wait, why you go too far? Okay. All right, Diane, take the next one.
Women seldom went to the Passover feast at Jerusalem. They were not required to be present. Jesus, however, virtually refused to go unless his mother would accompany them. And when his mother decided to go, many other Nazareth women were led to make the journey, so that the Passover company contained the largest number of women, in proportion to men, ever to go to the Passover from Nazareth. Ever and anon, on the way to Jerusalem, they chanted the 130th Psalm.
Okay, so this is the first moving of Jesus to try to get women involved in the Passover, wasn't it? Okay, and this is a picture of the city. This is Jerusalem, the city of David. It looked like today. Okay, I got lots of pictures to show you. Okay, and this is the temple at Jerusalem. This is a model, I should say, of the temple, and I got about 5 or 6 slides of the model. This is the city of, it's called this. This is a painting of the south wall. No, it wasn't. This is the south wall. This is a model of the south wall, what it looks like. Okay, and the next one is a painting of the south wall. What it looked like back in the days. And the next one is, this is the archaeological findings of the southern stair. Okay, what they found when they dug it up. You know, Jerusalem was destroyed about 60 years after Christ. That's what's left of it. This is the stairways to the court of the Gentiles, and they mention this in this paper. The stairway to the court of the Gentiles. Or in one of the other papers coming up. I'm not sure if it's this paper. It just gives you an idea of what these locations really look like. This is the courtyard, and it says, notice the stairs in the balustrade. So you can see the stairs. We have a little bit better picture of that. The next one coming up. That's this. This is what it would look like, and you can barely see the stairs on the bottom here going into the main part of the temple.
I don't see any of this. Your picture is
I
just
know,
sitting
you'll have
there.
to download them later looking at them.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. In the slideshow. Okay, and this is up close of the stairs going in. And this is what it would look like at Jesus' time. So this is you could imagine a young boy going to something this magnificent when, we've never seen anything like this before. Okay, and this is Antonia's fortress. This castle on the top of the mound, 2 bridges connect the castle and the temple, but arch bridges are missing in this model. See the other pictures. So there's a missing part of it. But it gives you an idea how magnificent the temple was in the time of Jesus. This is the pool of Bethesda. There. That's what this is. Okay. And this is an overall view of Jerusalem, what it would have looked like back then. And you can see the tourists over here in the corner, right? I think I skipped over. But that's okay. Y'all can look at these later at your leisure. Another view. This is the poor side part of the city of Jerusalem. This would be the temple in the background, but this would be where all the peasants would live. People had no money. Okay, and this is another picture, I believe, of the pool of Bethesda. No, this is Pool of Shalom, I'm sorry, the city of David. And that's what this is right down here in the bottom of the picture. Okay? All right. Maya? From the time they left Nazareth until they reached the summit of the Mount of Olives, Jesus experienced one long stretch of expectant anticipation. All through a joyful childhood, he had reverently heard of Jerusalem and its temple. Now he was soon to behold them in reality. From the Mount of Olives and from the outside, the closer inspection, the temple had been all the more than Jesus had expected. And when he once entered its sacred portals, the great disillusionment began. And this is the trip as they come down to Jerusalem. You see Jerusalem here in Bethany, Bethlehem. Okay. This is, hang on, let me get my notes here for this one because it's small. All right, this is the Mount of Olives. Okay, right up here. Okay, and this is Jerusalem, and this is Bethany over here where they stayed. So you see, they had about a half a mile trek into Jerusalem from where they spent the night. Okay, I hope these slides help give you a better picture. Okay, Melody, would you take the next one?
In company with his parents, Jesus passed through the temple precincts on his way to join that group of new sons of the law who were about to be consecrated as citizens of Israel. He was a little disappointed by the general demeanor of the temple throngs, but the first great shock of the day came when his mother took leave of them on her way to the women's gallery. It had never occurred to Jesus that his mother was not to accompany him to the consecration ceremonies, and he was thoroughly indignant that she was made to suffer from such unjust discrimination. While he strongly resented this, aside from a few remarks of protest to his father, he said nothing. But he thought, and thought deeply, as the questions to the scribes and teachers a week later disclosed.
So this is the type of discrimination that went on, right, during Jesus' life, and continues on today in some parts of the world, right? Women are treated as second-class citizens. All right. So this is why later on in his life he stressed the importance that women were equal with men, right? Because women weren't allowed to worship in the temple like the men were. Okay?
He passed through the consecration rituals, but was disappointed by their perfunctory and routine natures. He missed that personal interest which characterized the ceremonies of the synagogue at Nazareth. He then returned to greet his mother and prepared to accompany his father on his first trip about the temple, on its various courts, galleries, and corridors. The temple precincts could accommodate over 200,000 worshippers at one time, and while the vastness of these buildings, in comparison with any he had ever seen, greatly impressed his mind, he was more intrigued by the contemplation of the spiritual significance of the temple ceremonies and their associated worship.
Can you imagine a building that would accommodate
200 as a one.
200,000 worshipers? That's a lot of people, you know.
It's Colosseum.
It's like a coliseum, yeah, and you see why why they made a trek to you know, this was a major thing to go back. All right. Through many of the temple rituals were very touchingly impressed. Though many of the temple rituals very touchingly impressed his sense of the beautiful and symbolic, he was always disappointed by the explanation of the real meanings of these ceremonies, which his parents would offer in answer to his many searching questions. Jesus simply would not accept explanations of worship and religious devotion which involved belief in the wrath of God or the anger of the Almighty. And further discussion of these questions after the conclusion of the temple visit When his father became wildly insistent that he acknowledge acceptance of the Orthodox Jewish beliefs, Jewish turned suddenly upon his parents and looking appealing into the eyes of his father said, "My father, it cannot be true. The Father in heaven cannot so regard his erring children on earth. The Heavenly Father cannot love his children less than you love me. And I well know, no matter what unwise thing I might do, you would never pour out wrath upon me nor vent anger against me. If you, my earthly father, possess such human reflections of divine, how much more would the Heavenly Father be filled with goodness and overflowing with mercy? I refuse to believe that my Father in heaven loves me less than my Father on earth." Makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
It's common sense.
Common sense. All right, Nellie, would you take the next one?
Okay, when Joseph and Mary heard these words of their firstborn son, they held their peace. And never again did they seek to change his mind about the love of God and the mercifulness of the Father in heaven.
Okay, so they submitted to him, didn't they?
It's true.
You know, because it made perfect sense to them too. Okay.
1. Jesus views the temple. Everywhere Jesus went throughout the temple courts, he was shocked and sickened by the spirit of irreverence which he observed. He deemed the conduct of the temple throngs to be inconsistent with their presence in his Father's house. But he received the shock of his young life when his father escorted him into the courts of the Gentiles with its noisy jargon, loud talking and cursing, mingled indiscriminately with the bleating of sheep and the babble of noises which betrayed the presence of the money changers and the vendors of sacrificial animals and sundry other commercial commodities.
So it just looked like a outside market, and sounded like it too. All right, and this is a picture from above of the temple. Okay, and what I wanted to point out here is the court of the women out here on this side, and this is where all the men go. Okay, and I have another slide, which is, look, this is the same thing. And if you go out to the website, there is a key and tells you exactly where everything is on these two. Okay. But most of all was his sense of propriety outraged by the sight of the frivolous courtesans parading about within the precinct of the temple. Just such painted women as he had so recently seen when on a visit to Sepphoris. This profanation of the temple fully aroused all his youthful indignation, and he did not hesitate to express himself freely to Joseph. So they were selling themselves inside the temple, right? And of course this upset Jesus.
Jesus admired the sentiment of service of the temple, but he was shocked by the spiritual ugliness which he beheld on the faces of so many of the unthinking worshippers.
Go ahead and take the next one too, Millie, because that was short.
They now passed down to the priest court beneath the rock ledge in front of the temple where the altar stood, to observe the killing of the droves of animals and the washing away of the blood from the hands of the officiating slaughter priest at the bronze fountain. The blood-stained pavement, the gory hands of the priest, and the sounds of the dying animals were more than his nature-loving lad could stand. I can't even read it. The terrible sight sickened the boy of Nazareth. He clutched his father's arm and begged to be taken away. They walked back through the court of the Gentiles, and even the coarse laughter and profane jesting which he there heard were a relief from the sights he had just beheld.
Okay, so this upset him greatly, didn't it? Because just as these lambs were slaughtered, he in the future would be slaughtered just like the lamb, wouldn't he? Okay, and this is another illustration of.
It's very graphically written.
It is.
Ugh.
This is a good overview of what it would look like. The court of the Gentiles, the beautiful gate going into the temple, and Tonia's fortress up here. And here you can see the bridge going into the temple too. Okay, and this is the main entrance. Alright, it's a nice picture to go through. And this has got numbers on it. This is Jerusalem and the temple. And if you look at the next slide, it tells you exactly what it is. Okay, so y'all can look at that at your leisure. Okay. So, here, would you take the next one?
Joseph saw how his son had sickened at the sight of the temple rites and wisely led him around to view the Gate Beautiful, the artistic gate made of Corinthian bronze. But Jesus had had enough for his first visit at the temple. They returned to the upper court for Mary and walked about in the open air and away from the crowds for an hour, viewing the Asmonean palace, the stately home of Herod, and the tower of the Roman guards. During this stroll, Joseph explained to Jesus that only the inhabitants of Jerusalem were permitted to witness the daily sacrifices in the temple, and that the dwellers in Galilee came up only 3 times a year to participate in the temple worship. At the Passover, at the Feast of Pentecost, 7 weeks after Passover, and at the Feast of Tabernacles in October. These feasts were established by Moses. They then discussed the 2 latter established feasts of the dedication and of Purim. Afterward, they went to their lodgings and made ready for the celebration of the Passover.
Okay, and I just showed you a picture. Let's go back 2 slides here. This is the Gate Beautiful down here. Okay. I believe. No, it's up there. It's right here. Okay, going into the temple. Okay. Talking about there. Okay, Jesus and the Passover. Okay. Jesus and the Passover. 5 Nazareth families were guests of or associates with the family of Simon of Bethany. And in the celebration of the Passover, Simon having purchased the paschal lamb for the company, it was the slaughter of these lambs in such enormous numbers that had been so affected Jesus on his temple visit. It had been a plan to eat the Passover with Mary's relatives, but Jesus persuaded his parents to accept the invitation to go to Bethany. Now this is the first time he meets Lazarus, right? And his 2 sisters. Okay. Millie, would you take that?
That night they assembled for the Passover rites, eating the roasted flesh with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Jesus, being a new son of the covenant, was asked to recount the origin of the Passover, and this he did well. But he somewhat disconcerted his parents by the inclusion of numerous remarks mildly reflecting the impressions made on his youthful but thoughtful mind by the things which he had so recently seen and heard. This was the beginning of the 7-day ceremonies of the Feast of Passover.
Can you imagine what Jesus must have said? Witnessing the slaughter of all the animals, and they're sitting there getting ready to eat one. I'm sure he had a few choice words to bring out.
Even at this early date, though, he said nothing about such matters to his parents. Jesus had begun to turn over in his mind the propriety of celebrating the Passover without the slaughtered lamb. He felt assured in his own mind that the Father in heaven was not pleased with the spectacle of sacrificial offerings, and as the years passed, he became increasingly determined someday to establish a celebration of a bloodless Passover.
And that's exactly what he did. All right. Jesus slept very little that night. His rest was greatly disturbed by revolting dreams of slaughter and suffering. His mind was distraught and his heart torn by the inconsistencies and absurdities of the theology of the whole Jewish ceremonial system. Imagine that. His parents likewise slept little. They were greatly disconcerted by the events of the day just ended. By the events of the days just ended. They were completely upset in their own hearts by the lad's to them strange and determined attitude. Mary became nervously agitated during the forward part of the night, but Joseph remained calm, though he was equally puzzled. Both of them feared to talk frankly with the lad about these problems, though Jesus would gladly have talked with his parents if they had dared to encourage him. Okay, so they all had a little bit of a sleepless night, didn't they? Would you take the next one?
The next day's services at the temple were more acceptable to Jesus and did much to relieve the unpleasant memories of the previous day. The following morning, young Lazarus took Jesus in hand, and they began a systematic exploration of Jerusalem and its environs. Before the day was over, Jesus discovered the various places about the temple where teaching and question conferences were in progress. And aside from a few visits to the Holy of Holies to gaze in wonder as to what really was behind the veil of separation, he spent most of his time about the temple at these teaching conferences.
Okay, so this is two young boys just coming of age, exploring Jerusalem and exploring the temple and trying to figure everything out, basically, right?
Yes.
All right.
And that's when some of our deepest friendships are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Again. Throughout the Passover week, Jesus kept his place among the new sons of the commandment, and this meant that he must seat himself outside the rail, which segregated all persons who were not full citizens of Israel. Being thus made conscious of his youth, he refrained from asking the many questions which surged back and forth in his mind. At least he refrained until the Passover celebration had ended, and these restrictions on the newly consecrated youths were lifted.
Okay, and this is a picture today of what that looks like. It still happens there. And this is what they would say kept his place among the sons of the commandment. This is a bar mitzvah going on in Jerusalem. That's what they're talking about here. Okay. All right. Break this up a little bit. On Wednesday of the Passover week, Jesus was permitted to go home with Lazarus to spend the night at Bethany. This evening, Lazarus, Martha, and Mary heard Jesus discuss things temporal and eternal, human and divine. And from that night on, they all three loved him as if he had been their own brother. So that's where they made their bond right there, right?
By the end of the week, Jesus saw less of Lazarus since he was not eligible for admission to even the outer circles of the temple discussions, though he attended some of the public talks delivered in the outer courts. Lazarus was the same age as Jesus, but in Jerusalem, youths were seldom admitted to the consecration of sons of the law until they were a full 13 years of age.
Self-explanatory. Let's keep moving.
Again and again during the Passover week, his parents would find Jesus sitting off by himself with his youthful head in his hands, profoundly thinking. They had never seen him behave like this, and not knowing how much he was confused in mind and troubled in spirit by the experience through which he was passing, they were sorely perplexed. They did not know what to do. They welcomed the passing of the days of the Passover week and longed to have their strangely acting son safely back in Nazareth.
So he was struggling with all these things he was seeing and learning as he was there, wasn't he? Okay. Day by day, Jesus was thinking through his problems. By the end of the week, he had made many adjustments, but when the time came to return to Nazareth, his youthful mind was still swarming with perplexities and beset by the host of unanswered questions and unsolved problems.
Before Joseph and Mary left Jerusalem, in company with Jesus' Nazareth teacher, they made definite arrangements for Jesus to return when he reached the age of 15 to begin his long course of study in one of the best-known academies of the rabbis. Jesus accompanied his parents and teacher on their visits to the school, but they were all distressed to observe how indifferent he seemed to all they said and did. Mary was deeply pained at his reactions to the Jerusalem visit, and Joseph was profoundly perplexed at the lad's strange remarks and unusual conduct.
Because he had a higher concept of all those things, even as a youth, didn't he?
Yes.
So many of these things just did not make sense to him. You know, he thought they were silly, and we can see why now, right?
After all, Passover week had been a great event in Jesus' life. He had enjoyed the opportunity of meeting scores of boys about his own age, fellow candidates for the consecration, and he utilized such contacts as a means of learning how people lived in Mesopotamia, Turkestan, and Parthia, as well as in the far western provinces of Rome. He was already fairly conversant with the way in which the youth of Egypt and other regions near Palestine grew up. There were thousands of young people in Jerusalem at this time, and the Nazareth lad personally met and more or less extensively interviewed more than 150. He was particularly interested in those who hailed from the far eastern and the remote western countries. As a result of these contacts, the lad began to entertain a desire to travel about the world, for the purpose of learning how the various groups of his fellow men toiled for their livelihood.
And he did just that, didn't he, on his trip to Rome later on in his life. He had to raise a family first. Okay. Departure of Joseph and Mary. It had been arranged that the Nazareth party should gather in the region of the temple at mid-forenoon on the first day of the week after the Passover festival had ended. This they did and started out on the return journey to Nazareth. Jesus had gone into the temple to listen to the discussions while his parents awaited the assembly of their fellow travelers. Presently, the company prepared to depart, the men going in one group and the women in the other, as were their custom in journeying to and from the Jerusalem festivals. Jesus had gone up to Jerusalem in company with his mother and the women. Being now a young man of the consecration, he was supposed to journey back to Nazareth in company with his father and the men. But as the Nazareth party moved on toward Bethany, Jesus was completely absorbed in the discussions of angels in the temple, being wholly unmindful of the passing of time for the departure of his parents. And he did not realize that he had been left behind until the noontime adjournment of the temple conferences. So he got caught up in the discussions, didn't he? We do that all the time, don't we?
Yeah.
All right.
The Nazareth travelers did not miss Jesus because Mary surmised he journeyed with the men, while Joseph thought he traveled with the women, since he had gone up to Jerusalem with the women, leading Mary's donkey. They did not discover his absence until they reached Jericho and prepared to tarry for the night. After making inquiries of the last of the party to reach Jericho and learning that none of them had seen their son, they spent a sleepless night turning over in their minds what might have happened to him, recounting many of his unusual reactions to the events of the Passover week, and mildly chiding each other for not seeing to it that he was in the group before they left Jerusalem.
This is why we check, make sure all the kids are in the car when we stop somewhere. Right?
That's right.
It could happen to anybody, right? All right, and that's exactly what happened. All right.
For first and second days in the temple. In the meantime, Jesus had remained in the temple throughout the afternoon, listening to the discussions and enjoying the more quiet and decorous atmosphere. The great crowds of Passover week having about disappeared. At the conclusion of the afternoon discussions, in none of which Jesus participated, he betook himself to Bethany, arriving just as Simon's family made ready to partake of their evening meal. The three youngsters were overjoyed to greet Jesus, and he remained in Simon's house for the night. He visited very little during the evening, spending much of his time alone in the garden meditating.
It's interesting that he did not take off and try to catch up with the party going on, isn't it?
He had a lot of common sense.
He had a lot of common sense. All right. Early next day, Jesus was up and on his way to the temple. On the brow of Olivet, he paused and wept over the sight his eyes beheld, a spiritually impoverished people, tradition-bound and living under the surveillance of the Roman legions. Forenoon found him in the temple and his mind made up to take part in the discussions. Meanwhile, Jesus and Mary also had arisen with the early dawn with the intention of retracing their steps to Jerusalem. First they hastened to the house of their relatives, where they had lodged as a family during the Passover weeks, but inquiring elicited the fact that no one had seen Jesus. After searching all day and finding no trace of him, they returned to their relatives for the night. So they went looking where they thought he would obviously be, but he wasn't, was it? And this is a picture of...
I thought that's where Jesus had stayed overnight.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. Well, it was when their family was there, but they stayed also with Simon. They stayed with the family on the way in, and then after they got there, they stayed with Simon, right? And this picture I just skipped over is Jesus and the discussions in the temple. All right?
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
At the second conference, Jesus had made bold to ask questions, and in a very amazing way, he participated in the temple discussions, but always in a manner consistent with his youth. Sometimes his pointed questions were somewhat embarrassing to the learned teachers of the Jewish law, but he evinced such a spirit of candid fairness, coupled with an evident hunger for knowledge, that the majority of the temple teachers were disposed to treat him with every consideration. But when he presumed to question the justice of putting to death a drunken Gentile who had wandered outside the court of the Gentiles and unwittingly entered the forbidden and reputedly sacred precincts of the temple, one of the more tolerant teachers grew impatient, and the lad's implied criticisms and glowering down upon him asked how old he was. Jesus replied, 13 years, lacking a trifle more than 4 months.
12 3/4. Right.
Then rejoined the now irate teacher, why are you here, since you are not of age as a son of the law? And when Jesus explained that he had received consecration during the Passover, and that he was a finished student of the Nazareth schools, the teachers with one accord derisively replied, we might have known, he's from Nazareth. But the leader insisted that Jesus was not to be blamed if the rulers of the synagogue at Nazareth had graduated him, technically when he was 12 instead of 13. And notwithstanding that several of his detractors got up and left, it was ruled that the lad might continue undisturbed as a pupil of the temple discussions.
Now think about this. This is interesting. He was asking him what the justice was of putting a man to death because he was drunk and wandered into an area he wasn't supposed to be, right? I mean, it makes sense you would ask such a question, but apparently they didn't think so. So when his second day in the temple was finished, again he went to Bethany for the night, and again he went out in the garden to meditate and pray. It was apparent that his mind was concerned with the contemplation of weighty problems. Isn't it interesting that every time Jesus had questions about something, what did he do?
He went to the garden to pray.
He went to the garden to meditate and pray, didn't he? Okay, third day in the temple. Millie?
Number 5, the third day in the temple. Jesus' third day with the scribes and teachers in the temple witnessed gathering of many spectators who, having heard of the youth from Galilee, came to enjoy the experience of seeing a lad confuse the wise men of the law. Simon also came down from Bethany to see what the boy was up to. Throughout this day, Joseph and Mary continued their anxious search for Jesus, and going several times into the temple, but never thinking to scrutinize the several discussion groups, although they once came almost within hearing distance of his fascinating voice.
So he was there, they just didn't find him, did they?
Their mind was.
They didn't know what they were looking for.
That's right. This has got several paragraphs on it there. Let me bring this one down. It'll be easy. Go all the way to the end of the fifth there. Okay.
Before the day had ended, the entire attention of the chief discussion group of the temple had become focused upon the questions being asked by Jesus. Among his many questions were, number 1, what really exists in the Holy of Holies behind the veil? 2, why should mothers in Israel be segregated from the male temple worshippers? 3, if God is a father who loves his children, why all the slaughter of animals to gain divine favor? Has the teaching of Moses been misunderstood? 4, Since the temple is dedicated to the worship of the Father in heaven, is it consistent to permit the presence of those who engage in secular barter and trade? 5. Is the expected Messiah to become a temporal prince to sit on the throne of David, or is he to function as the light of the life and the establishment of a spiritual kingdom?
All good questions.
All great questions.
You know, you can see why they were confused. They didn't know how to answer any of them, did they?
Because they apparently never thought about them.
They never thought about them. It just been accepted as the law.
Yeah.
And that's a picture of Jesus during the temple discussions. It's interesting. Interesting how different artists do this.
It's interesting too because older people sometimes take offense at youth for
Being
actually-
asking questions.
Right, they find it to be disrespectful, so they close the child down. And
The
don't
other
allow
thing
them
is,
to-
many times they don't know how to answer them, so that's why they
Right,
get
they
agitated.
become defensive.
That's
yeah.
right. That's right. And all the day through, those who listened marveled at the questions, and none was more astonished than Simon. For more than 4 hours, this Nazareth youth plied these Jewish teachers with thought-provoking and heart-searching questions. He made few comments on the remarks of his elders. He conveyed his teaching by the questions he would ask. By the deft and subtle phrases of a question, he would at one and the same time challenge their teaching and suggest his own. In the manner of his asking a question, there was an appealing combination of sagacity and humor, which endeared him even to those who more or less resented his youthfulness. He was always eminently fair and considerate in asking these penetrating questions. On this eventful afternoon in the temple, he exhibited that same reluctance to take unfair advantage of an opponent which characterized his entire subsequent public ministry. As a youth and later on as a man, he seemed to be utterly free from all egotistic desire to win an argument merely to experience logical triumph over his fellows, being interested supremely in just one thing, to proclaim the everlasting truth and thus effect a fuller revelation of the eternal God. So he started preaching even when he was just a little over 12, didn't he? Really? Take the next two if you would, dear.
Okay. When the day was over, Simon and Jesus wended their way back to Bethany. For the most part of the distance, both the man and the boy were silent. Again, Jesus paused on the brow of Olivet, but as he viewed the city and its temple, he did not weep. He only bowed his head in silent devotion. After the evening meal at Bethany, he again declined to join the merry circle, but instead went to the garden, where he lingered long in the night, vainly endeavoring to think out some definite plan of approach to the problem of his life work, and to decide how best he might labor to reveal to his spiritually blinded countrymen a more beautiful concept of the Heavenly Father, and so set them free from their terrible bondage to law, ritual, ceremony, and musty tradition. But that the clear light did not come to the truth-seeking lad.
All right. So he knew early in his life that all these teachings needed to be retaught, overthrown. Yep.
Corrected.
Correct.
Correct.
That's right. All right.
6. The fourth day in the temple. Jesus was strangely unmindful of his earthly parents, even at breakfast when Lazarus' mother remarked that his parents must be about home by that time. Jesus did not seem to comprehend that they would be somewhat worried about his having lingered behind.
Because he was about his father's business, right? That's right. Again he journeyed to the temple, but he did not pause to meditate at the brow of Olivet. In the course of the morning's discussions, much time was devoted to the law of the prophets, and the teachers were astonished that Jesus was so familiar with the scriptures in Hebrew as well as Greek. But they were amazed not so much by his knowledge of this truth as by his youth. You know, he didn't pause on the way on the brow of Olivet because he felt what? He felt this need to get in there and get it done, didn't
He
he?
knew his parents would be looking for him.
He knew his time was short, so he had to get the job done, didn't he? Okay. All right. Millie?
At the afternoon conference, they had hardly begun to answer his question relating to the purpose of prayer when the leader invited the lad to come forward and, sitting beside him, bade him to state his own views regarding prayer and worship.
Okay. So he got to state his own views.
The evening before, Jesus' parents had heard about the strange youth who so deftly sparred with the expounders of the law, but it had not occurred to them that this lad was their son. They had about decided to journey out to the home of Zacharias, as they thought Jesus might have gone thither to see Elizabeth and John. Thinking Zacharias might perhaps be at the temple, they stopped there on their way to the city of Judah. As they strolled through the courts of the temple, imagine their surprise and amazement when they recognized the voice of the missing lad and beheld him seated among the temple's teachers.
There he was. And this is an illustration of that. Him sitting among the temple teachers.
It's amazing to me that they had heard about a strange youth who so deftly sparred with the expounders of the law. They
Yeah.
must have been they're really dense. If they didn't suspect.
And he was a child of promise.
And he was the child of promise. You'd think that
You know,
it's got to be him. Yeah.
Uh,
Joseph was speechless, but Mary gave vent to her long pent-up fear and anxiety when, rushing up to the lad now standing to greet his astonished parents, she said, "My child, why have you treated us like this? And now it is more than 3 days that your father and I have searched for you, sorrowing whatever possessed you to desert us." It was a tense moment. All eyes were turned on Jesus to hear what he had to say. His father looked reprovingly at him, but said nothing. All right. Go ahead, Millie. Take the next.
It should be remembered that Jesus was supposed to be a young man. He had finished the regular schooling of a child, had been recognized as a son of the law, and had received consecration as a citizen of Israel. And yet his mother more than mildly upbraided him before all of the people assembled, right in the midst of the most serious and sublime effort of his young life, thus bringing to an inglorious termination one of the greatest opportunities ever to be granted him, to function as a teacher of truth, a preacher of righteousness, a revealer of the loving character of his Father in heaven.
So he was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, right?
His mother was out of order.
Yes, she was, but that's okay. And this Mother's Day, we'll forgive her, right?
Yeah, like
Okay.
But the lad was equal to the occasion. When you take into fair consideration and the factors which combine to make up this situation, you will be better prepared to fathom the wisdom of the boy's reply to his mother's unintended rebuke. After a moment's thought, Jesus answered his mother, saying, "Why is it that you have so long sought me? Would you not expect to find me in my Father's house, since the time has come when I should be about my Father's business?"
But he was just being logical, wasn't he? Makes sense to him. Where else would he be? Okay. Everyone was astonished at the lad's manner of speaking. Silently they all withdrew and left him standing alone with his parents. Presently the young man relieved the embarrassment of all three when he quietly said, "Come, my parents, none has done aught but that what they thought best. Our Father in heaven has ordained these things. Let us depart for home." Okay, Millie, would you take the next one, please?
In silence they started out, arriving at Jericho for the night. Only once did they pause, and that on the brow of Olivet, when the lad raised his staff aloft, and quivering from head to foot under the surging of intense emotion, said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, and the people thereof, what slaves you are, subservient to the Roman yoke and victims of your own traditions. But I will return to cleanse yonder temple and deliver my people from this bondage."
And I thought this was appropriate. The next slide is a painting of the falling of Jerusalem, 60 years after Christ's death.
On the 3 days' journey to Nazareth, Jesus said little, neither did his parents say much in his presence. They were truly at a loss to understand the conduct of their firstborn son, but they did treasure in their hearts his sayings, even though they could not fully comprehend their meanings.
So they were totally at a loss what to do or say, right? Upon reaching home, Jesus made a brief statement to his parents, assuring them of his affection and implying that they need not fear he would again give any occasion for their suffering and anxiety because of his conduct. He concluding this momentous statement by saying, "While I must do the will of my Father in heaven, I will also be obedient to my Father on earth. I will await my hour." How many times did he say, "My hour has not yet come"? You know?
He has said before that he would honor the wishes of his earthly father.
That's right.
He was very aware of his need to obey
Yes.
his parents.
That's right. You want to take that one, the next one, Millie?
Though Jesus, in his mind, would many times refuse to consent to the well-intended but misguided efforts of his parents to dictate the course of his thinking or to establish the plan of his work on earth, still, in every manner consistent with his dedication to the doing of his Father's will, he did most gracefully conform to the desires of his earthly father and to the usages of his family in the flesh. Even when they could not consent, he would do everything possible to conform. Even when he could not consent, he would do everything possible to conform, and was an artist in the matter of adjusting his dedication to his obligations of family loyalty and social service.
So if I tried as best he could to work it around so he was doing what they wanted, yet still doing the will of his Father in heaven, right?
Yes, adjusting.
Adjusting. That's right.
Very good.
He was an artist at adjusting.
That's right.
Joseph was puzzled, but Mary, as she reflected on these experiences, gained comfort, eventually viewing his utterance on Olivet as prophetic of the messianic mission of her son as Israel's deliverer. She set to work with renewed energy to mold his thoughts into patriotic and nationalistic channels and enlisted the efforts of her brother, Jesus' favorite uncle. And in every other way did the mother of Jesus address herself to the task of preparing her firstborn son to assume the leadership of those who would restore the throne of David and forever cast off the Gentile yoke of political bondage.
Isn't it interesting that we end today and this week with a dedication of a mother and to do what's right for her son, right? I think that's apropos for Mother's Day too.
It is.
I really
Definitely
do.
is.
So, Millie, would you like to close us with a prayer today?
Yes, thank you. Heavenly Father, we are grateful for one more opportunity that you've given us to study these new words and find new meaning for our lives on this planet. Be with us as we take on new thoughts and ideas. Help us to utilize them as you would have us to do. Be with us throughout this week until we come back together again. We love and honor you, and we ask these things in the name of Christ Michael, Jesus. Amen.
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 Thank you for joining us. Please come see us again. Happy Mother's Day, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.